In 1967, American spy satellites photographed something impossible in the Caspian Sea. It was not a plane. It was not a ship. It was a monster. A 500-ton beast designed to win World War III. The Soviets called it the ultimate superweapon, but this titan had a fatal secret. It was terrified of the ocean. This video is about the most useless, bizarre, and terrifying weapon ever built, and why it was left to rot on a beach. If this mystery has grabbed you, if this image is stuck in your head, subscribe and leave a like. Because the truth is stranger than fiction. To understand this machine, you need to forget the rules. Forget what you know about flying. Forget what you know about navigating. The Ekranoplan belonged to neither world. It exploited a loophole in physics, a phenomenon called ground effect. It works like this. When a wing moves very fast and very close to the surface, the air has nowhere to escape. It gets compressed. It forms a cushion, a dense cushion of air that pushes the wing up. It's not exactly flying. It's floating on a pillow of air, created by your own speed. A motorized float at 600 kilometers per hour. But who would dare build such a thing? To understand the creator, you need to understand fear. The Cold War was at its freezing point. The world lived in the shadow of mutual destruction. NATO, led by the United States, controlled the seas. Their aircraft carrier battle groups were floating fortresses. Their nuclear submarines, Polaris, Los Angeles class, were ghosts, silent, deadly. They could surface off the Soviet coast and wipe Moscow off the map in minutes. The Soviet Navy was desperate. Their ships were heavy and slow. Their patrol planes were easy targets. They needed a miracle, an antidote, something that couldn't be seen, something that couldn't be caught. That's when one man made an impossible promise. Rostislav Alexiev, a genius, a visionary, the father of Soviet hydrofoils. The Rakata and Meteor speedboats that cut through the rivers were his invention. He had already made ships fly, but he looked at the ground effect and saw the future of war. He went to the Kremlin. He went directly to Nikita Khrushchev. He promised a fleet of ships that would have the speed of airplanes and the cargo capacity of warships. They would cross the Black Sea in an hour, unload tanks on the coast of Turkey, and disappear. They would hunt American submarines and destroy aircraft carriers. All of this while flying below radar and above sonar. Sonar wouldn't detect them because they didn't touch the water. Radar wouldn't detect them because they flew 4 meters high. It would be the phantom weapon, the perfect punch. Khrushchev, a man who loved audacious, gigantic projects, gave Alexiev a blank check and an impossible deadline. The Central Hydrofoil Design Bureau received the secret task to build the impossible. The first result was the Korabel maquette, the prototype ship, Project KM, to the CIA, which saw its grainy satellite photos. It was simply the Caspian Sea monster, and it was a fitting name. Building it was an engineering nightmare. They needed aluminum-magnesium alloys light enough to fly, strong enough to withstand the sea. But they were hell to weld. They needed power. Absurd power. They took 10 Dobrynin VD-7 jet engines ripped from Tu-22 strategic bombers. 8 engines were mounted on the front, just above the cockpit, pointed slightly downward. They weren't just for pushing. They blew air directly under the wings to create the air cushion even at low speed. It was the blast that made it take off from the water. 2 extra engines were mounted on the tail just for cruise speed. In 1966, it was ready at a secret base near Gorky. It was so large it had to be disassembled, transported down the Volga River only at night, covered in tarps, to the test base in Kaspiysk on the Caspian Sea. When the team assembled it on the dock, the silence was absolute. The scale was alien. 92 meters long, almost the size of a football field. A wingspan of 37 meters. A gigantic tail the size of an apartment building. Total weight, 544 tons. It was, by far, the heaviest aircraft in the world, and it would remain so for 30 years. The first test. Alexeyev himself was at the controls. The 10 engines roared. A window-shattering sound, a wall of smoke and water spray. The beast trembled and began to move. Slow, clumsy, fighting the water's drag. The 8 front ensigns screamed, forcing air under the wings. Then physics engaged. The chem rose. It left the water. 3 meters. 4 meters. And it accelerated like nothing on Earth. 300 kilometers per hour. 400, 500. It reached a cruising speed of 650 kilometers per hour. A warship moving faster than a turboprop plane. A blur on the Caspian horizon. The test was a thundering success. Alexeyev proved it was possible. At the Pentagon, the CIA was in crisis mode. What the hell was that? A plane that lost its wings. A ship that grew jet engines. The Caspian Sea monster became the top intelligence priority. They didn't know what it did, but they knew it was big and it was fast. The KM tested for 15 long years. It was Alexeyev's floating laboratory. It proved the concept. But the KM was just that. A prototype. It wasn't a weapon. It was temperamental and complex. The military needed something they could use in the field. Something practical. The first practical project was the A-90 Orleanic. The Eagle. This one was different. It wasn't a colossus of speed. It was an amphibious assault vehicle. Smaller. More agile. It had 1 giant turboprop engine on the tail and 2 jet engines in the nose. Why? The entire nose open to the side. Like a cargo plane. It could carry 150 assault troops. Or to be TR. Armored vehicles. The combat doctrine was revolutionary. The Orleanic would cross the Black Sea or the Baltic at 400 kilometers per hour. Invisible to radar. It wouldn't stop in the water. It would use the ground effect to ride up the beach. It would land on the sand using its reinforced landing gear. The ramp would lower. The tanks and soldiers would pour out, attacking the enemy's rear. An amphibious invasion completed before the enemy could even react. The Soviet Navy ordered 120 units. They built 5, but the problems began immediately. In 1975, Turingates and Orleanic crashed. The fuselage, made of light alloys, couldn't handle the stress. It cracked while landing in slightly choppy water. No one was seriously injured, but confidence was broken. They redesigned it using stronger materials, but the doubt was planted. And the Minister of Defense, Dmitry Ustinov, Alexeyev's patron, was getting impatient. He was less interested in troop transport and more interested in the main prize, destroying American aircraft carriers. He wanted a punch to NATO's chin. He wanted the carrier killer. Alexeyev was instructed to focus all resources on Project 903, the long-class Ekranoplan. The Harrier. This was not a prototype. It was not a transport vehicle. This was an executioner. The Lun was the pure distillation of Cold War terror. 73 meters long. 8 Kuznetsov. Enika 87 jet engines. Mounted on top. On forward canards. Away from the deadly salt spray. And on its back, its reason for existence. 6 giant launch tubes. Loaded with 6 P-270 Mosket missiles. The Sunburn, an anti-ship missile that flew at Mach 3. Skimming just meters above the waves. Almost impossible to intercept. A single Mosket could cripple a destroyer. 6 could destroy an aircraft carrier. The combat doctrine was from a science fiction movie. A squadron of Luns hidden at a secret Caspian base. Alerted by satellites, they would take off fly at 550 kilometers per hour, 4 meters high. Invisible to the enemy battle group's radar. They would appear on the horizon 100 kilometers from the target. The Lun's radar would light up lock onto the targets. They would fire their full salvo. 30 Mosket missiles roaring toward the American fleet. And before the carrier SF-14 fighters could even be launched, the Lun would already be on its way home. Vanished. It was the perfect asymmetric weapon. The first Lun, the MD-160, entered service with the Caspian flotilla in 1987. The Soviet Navy ordered 8. NATO was on high alert. The ultimate superweapon had been born. Then silence. The second Lun, which was under construction, was cancelled. The order for 8 disappeared. Only one was ever built. Why? What happened to the invincible weapon? The Soviet Union had the perfect weapon on paper, a monster that couldn't be seen, carrying missiles that couldn't be stopped. What could go wrong when you build the perfect predator? What do you think was the nail in the Ekranoplan's coffin? The cost, the politics, or the physics? Leave your theory in the comments. The truth is that the Lun and all Ekranoplans were defeated by an enemy Alexeyev could never beat. The real world. This video's title is not a metaphor. The monster was terrified of the ocean. Failure number 1. Physics itself. The ground effect, the air cushion, requires one thing above all. A flat, predictable surface, like the Caspian Sea, a giant, calm lake, or a river. But the North Atlantic Ocean, the Pacific, the battlefield of World War III is not calm. It is a chaos of storms. Waves of 5, 10, 15 meters. For the Ekranoplan, a 3-meter wave was not an obstacle. It was a brick wall, or a ramp. To fly at 500 kilometers per hour and hit a wave, the structural stress would snap the fuselage in half. If the pilot tried to jump the wave, he would climb, but as soon as he climbed, he left the ground effect. And the Ekranoplan was not a good airplane. Its wings were short and thick, made for ground effect, not for real flight. Without the air cushion, it stalled and fell from the sky like a 400-ton stone. The flight was brutally unstable. If the nose dipped 1 degree, it dived into the water. If the nose rose 1 degree, it climbed, stalled, and fell. The pilots were the elite of the Air Force, but they reported extreme fatigue. It was a constant, second-by-second fight against the elements. They weren't flying. They were surviving. Failure number 2. The environment. Salt water, the silent killer of all things mechanical. The Ekranoplan was an airplane that lived like a ship. The salt spray, the salt mist was constantly sucked into the 8 jet engines. The turbine blades made with millimeter tolerances were eaten alive, corroded, became unbalanced, failed. The lightweight alloy fuselage suffered from galvanic corrosion where different metals met. The maintenance was a 24-hour nightmare. Every flight required days of freshwater cleaning, inspection, and eye-watering repairs. It was expensive to build, but it was astronomically expensive to keep flying. Failure number 3. The giant target. The idea was to be invisible to radar, and it was while flying low in the middle of the ocean. But what about at the base? You cannot hide something 73 meters long. It didn't fit in a hangar. It was parked on the water, a perfect target for the first spy satellite or the first Tomahawk cruise missile. A single missile would destroy the entire fleet before they could even start their engines. And its combat maneuverability. Non-existent. An Ekranoplan doesn't turn. It makes a slow curve with a radius measured in kilometers, like a freight train on ice. In a straight line, it was a keen, but if it was detected, any F-14 Tomcat fighter could destroy it with ease. It was a shark that could only swim forward. A one-trick weapon. A trick that only worked on a calm day. On a lake. The final blow wasn't technical. It was political. And it was tragic. Rostislav Alexeyev, the genius, the father of the program, died in 1980. He was testing a new Orleanoc that he had modified. The vehicle crashed. He survived the impact, but suffered severe internal injuries. He died from complications 2 days after surgery. With him died the soul of the program. 4 years later, in 1984, his greatest champion in the Kremlin, the powerful Minister of Defense, Dmitry Ustinov, died. The new Soviet military command led by Mikhail Gorbachev was focused on reforms. They looked at the Ekranoplan and saw a vanity project. Incredibly expensive and tactically useless in the real world. The money dried up. It was diverted to nuclear submarines, ballistic missiles, to things that worked. In 1991, the Soviet Union itself collapsed, and the Ekranoplan program died with it. What remains of this titanic dream? Ghosts in a shipyard. The Kayam, the original monster, the largest of all, crashed in 1980, shortly before Alexeyev's death. Pilot error. The pilot tried to take off without giving full power to the front engines. The nose rose too fast. The monster stalled and slammed into the water. It broke in half. No one did. But the machine, the largest aircraft on the planet, sank in the shallow Caspian waters. Too heavy to salvage. It was left to rust. The Orleanics, the assault vehicles, were retired. One is in a museum in Moscow, a strange white relic of a future that never happened. But the Lon, the MD-160, the only carrier killer ever built. Its story is the same. With the end of the USSR, it remained at the naval base in Caspian Sea, guarded but forgotten. For 30 years, it sat there, rusting slowly in the harbor, a Goliath with no David, a predator with no prey. In 2020, a decision was made to turn it into a tourist attraction. A museum Kayed, Patriot Park in the city of Darband. They sent tugboats to pull the 380-ton giant across the Caspian Sea one last time, but the operation, like everything in the Ekranoplan's life, failed. A storm rolled in, the cables snapped, the tow crew couldn't hold it. And the Lun, the ultimate Superweapon, the carrier killer, washed ashore. On the beach, just meters from its destination. They couldn't move it. It was too heavy, too awkward, stuck in the sand. And there it sits, at this very moment, lying on the coast of Dagestan. Broken, open to the elements. Tourists take selfies with it. The sea it was built to dominate, but which it always feared, now reclaims it, slowly. It was not a plane. It was not a ship. It was a paradox, an engineering marvel and a complete design failure. A World War III weapon defeated by Rustin Bia. A wave, the most useless and most fascinating superweapon the world has ever seen. The Cold War was a graveyard of impossible dreams. The Ekranoplan was the largest of them all. If this story of ambition, engineering, and spectacular failure gripped you, you woe. And believe what the Soviets tried to build on the moon. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and prepare for the next chapter.